1 Timothy 2, verses 8 through 15.
All right. I desire then that in every place the men should pray. Antonio's got lots of opinions on this. Here we go. You gonna help me? All right. I desire then that in every place the men should pray, lifting holy hands without anger or quarreling. Likewise, also, that women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel, with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair, and gold, or pearls, or costly attire, but with what is proper for women who profess godliness with good works. Let a woman learn quietly, with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing, if they continue in faith and love and holiness and self-control.
That's it. The word of the Lord. We're going to keep trying it. Here's a good thing, actually, when you get to these passages. It really is good to go, like, even though internally you're like, oh, I don't know. It's good to actually flex the muscle of going, thank you, Lord, for this passage. All right? Okay. We are in 1 Timothy 2, verses 8 through 15. Just read it. And today, I want to talk about Paul's problem with women, part 1. All right? Paul's problem with women, part 1. Okay. Right up front, this is an extremely challenging passage, especially for modern people. Remember that we've said before, there's a tendency, particularly in American Christianity, we sometimes make hard things easy. Things that are like hard but clear, or things that are, there are some things that are hard, we're like, nah, it doesn't really say that. There are other things that are fairly straightforward and we make them very hard. This is one of those places that is just really hard. Okay? There may not be a harder passage in the New Testament. It's hard to know what's actually being said. It is hard to stomach, to our modern ears, much of what it seems to be saying. Most of us tend to skip over passages like this when what we really ought to be doing is leaning in and saying, what can I learn? There is a lot that can be known and understood about the passage. And what I want to do today is to try to give you like a bunch of things that will just hopefully help clarify and help you think about where to focus as you try to think about it. And then what we're going to say is, listen, go home and really spend some time this week thinking about it. And there's still a couple of different ways you can take it. So, I have 5 points I want to talk about today. First of all, I'm going to give you a caveat. Caution. All right. Second of all, I'm going to give you 3 basic options for interpreting this passage. There's kind of 3 basic approaches. Third, I'm going to tell you what the big problems are with the first approach. Fourth, I'm going to give you a bunch of data points. Fifth, I'm going to try to set up trajectory with some homework. All right. So a caveat. 3 basic options. Here's why I think the first one is most problematic. I'm going to give you the 4th data points, and then I'm going to give you a trajectory. All right? Got that? Here we go. Let's start with the caveat. This is a cautionary tale. I am going to tell you a story. It's called The Parable of the Enlightened College Graduates and a guy named Norm. Okay?
Is Norm real?
He's real, but that's not his name. Okay? This is a real story. But I'm using this as a parable. We were in Missoula when I planted my first church. Are you guys all familiar with the story of the prodigal son in the Bible? Luke 15. You have a younger son. Yes, did I say no? Okay, let me give it to you real quick. There's a younger son. This is a very famous story. A younger son with a really rich father. And he goes to his dad. And he says to his dad, I want all my inheritance right now. Which is basically him telling his dad, I want you dead so I can get my share of the inheritance. And his dad actually does it, gives it to him. The younger son goes and wanders the world, spending his fortune on wine, women, and song. And he ends up broke, destitute, working in a pig pen where he's like foraging scraps of food from the pigs. And the younger son comes to his senses and says, you know what? Even the servants in my father's house have like a great, they have a roof over their heads and they've got good food to eat. He's like, I'm going to go back, tell my father I've sinned against him and God, and ask him to please just hire me back on as a hired hand. So he goes back to the father. The father sees him a long ways away, sees his son coming, and he runs and embraces him before the son can even get the words out of his mouth. Father, the father's like, welcome home. And he puts the robe on him, puts the ring on him, and what he's doing is he's actually restoring him to his inheritance as a son. Just sheer love. He loves his son so much. Okay? So that's the story. And Keller likes to say, we think, oh, that's very heartwarming. The original audience would not have heard it's heartwarming. They would have been like, how dare the father do that? But that's the prodigal son. Okay. What most of you probably don't know, you're probably familiar with that. Buddhism also has a prodigal son story. You guys know this? Okay. In Buddhism, you literally have a father and a son. Okay? But this time, the son leaves the father before the father has made his fortune. Okay? So the son leaves his father. And basically, listen, it says the same thing. He's foolish. He travels the world, kind of spends it, wine, women, and song. Okay, he's broke. And basically, the son is like wandering through the world trying to make his way. And he actually comes to the father's estate, but his father has become very, very rich. And he comes to his father's estate. He doesn't know that this is his father's place. But the father sees him from afar, and he actually recognizes his son. But here's what happens next. The father doesn't run and embrace him. The father actually sends a servant, and basically sends servants, and they kind of shepherd the son, and they're like, hey, listen, you look like you could use some work. And so they put the guy to work. They give him a job. And basically, the whole story is he spends like 20 years working his way up through the organization, having no idea that the boss at the top, the guy he works for, is actually his dad. And finally, as his dad is ready to die, he has the son come in and he says, congratulations, I'm actually your father. The son's blown away, and he says, all that I have is now yours, because you have proved that you know how to work really well. You've worked your way up the ranks. I know I can hand it over to you. 2 stories. Okay. So here's the parable of the enlightened college graduates. So back in Missoula, we would do these things called explorers groups for people that were not necessarily churched. And we said, hey, as we're working through the gospel of actually at this time, I think we were looking at the parable of the prodigal son, we said it'd be really good for people to spend time with both of these. Let's actually workshop these and say what's similar and what's different. And what was fascinating was we had a group of young people, most of them were late 20s, very well educated. They had all been to like undergrad or grad school. Really thoughtful, really progressive. And when we got to this passage and we said, hey, how are these passages, how are these stories similar or different? They said, they're the same. Okay? They're basically the same story. They're telling the same story. And it was like, this is really interesting. Particularly because most of those young enlightened college grads would have identified as Christians. So they were like, listen, Buddhism and Christian's prodigal son, those are the same story. Now we had a guy also in the group that I'm calling Norm. And the reason I'm calling him Norm, it's like Norman McLean, author of River Runs Through It, fly fishing. This guy is the best fly fisherman in the world I've ever met. He taught Malachi how to fly fish, taught me how to fly fish. Norm was in his mid-40s. He was also very progressive and very opinionated. So Norm would sit down in a group, and like literally the first time we have a group, we're sitting there, everybody's kind of getting to know each other, and he's like, man, I just want to say, anybody that voted for George W. Bush is a fucking moron. And we're like, whoa. I'm like, this guy is over the top, okay? That's Norm. Super opinionated. And then this like woman pipes up, like in her 30s. She's like, I voted for George Bush, okay? And you're just like, oh my gosh. Now, here's the thing. Norm is not a Christian. He's like, I was raised Catholic. I don't buy any of that. I don't believe. I got beaten by the nuns. I have walked away. No way. He's like, I'm spiritual, but not religious. But he's sitting in there, and he goes, are you guys out of your mind? He's like, I cannot imagine two versions of this story that are more diametrically opposed. He's like, in the one, the Buddhist version, he's like, that son has to earn his father's love. And he's like, the Christian version is sheer grace. He's like, guys, I don't know about you, but this is complete opposites to me. All right, now listen. What I want to ask the question is, here's kind of the point of the parable. I actually think Norm was entirely right. Even though he's not a Christian, he saw something. And the other people that identified as Christians and were very well educated could not see it. And the question is why? And I have a theory. I actually think some of it had to do with youth. In other words, when you're in your 20s, you're usually fresh out of college, where you've been exposed to lots of new ideas, so you're thinking new thoughts. And it also happens that when you start thinking new thoughts, you get a lot of approval for thinking the right new thoughts. And all of their peers, everybody that they had been around, what they were taught in school, and I know this because they all went to school through Missoula, which is super, like calling somebody liberal is an insult. They're like, no, that's too conservative. We are like beyond that. They had been taught that all religions are basically the same. So if all religions are basically the same, then these two stories must be saying the exact same thing. And they were actually so tied to what their friends would think if they said something different that they weren't able to see anything different. Versus Norm. Norm didn't give a rat's ass when anybody cared about what it's like, he didn't care. He'd say whatever he thought. Didn't care what you thought of him. Now, what was really interesting was when that girl said, I actually voted for George Bush. What he didn't say is, oh, you're a moron. He actually said, really? Why? And he was deeply curious about people. So do you see the difference? In other words, one is not concerned with the approval of others, deeply curious, even though you might think they're a moron, curious about how they see the world. And he was in his 40s. I just think there's something that happens with some age and some exposure. The other were very, very smart people. But they actually had a blind spot. And I think their blind spot was their educational pool had been fairly small. And they were actually really unaware of how much they wanted the approval of their peers. That's my theory. Now listen, what's my point? Why did I waste 10 minutes telling you this?
Are we saying Paul wanted approval of his peers?
What'd you say?
Are we saying Paul wanted approval of his peers?
No, not saying that. I'm saying most of us have blind spots. And one of the things that we have blind spots is we want to be seen by the people around us as thoughtful and on the right side of history. And so oftentimes we can't see differences or things that are right in front of our face. Okay? And that would be really dangerous. And so I think everybody's got blind spots. So what you do about blind spot, number one, this is just the caution. Whatever our strong reaction is, you want to make sure that you're going like, hey, is this a blind spot or is this a genuine reaction? And one of the things that will help is being friends with people that think differently than you do. Okay? So being around Norm was great because he could see things from such a fresh perspective, and he actually really helped my perspective. Okay, he was actually the first person to become a Christian in Missoula, which is another story. Okay, but here's the point. There's blind spots. You want to work hard to be aware of your prejudices to avoid knee-jerk reactions, and my advice is be like Norm. Not a jerk, okay, but deeply curious and be friends with people who think differently. All right, so that's my first point. That's the caution. Second point, there's 3 basic approaches to how you read this passage. Okay, one is you could say Paul's teaching here is basically wrong. 2, and I'm going to unpack each of these. You could say Paul's teaching here is basically timely. It was appropriate, but just for that particular time, place, etc. Or 3, you could say Paul's teaching here is actually timeless. It's meant for all time, all ages, all cultures. And our culture this is the place where we rub up and we don't like what he has to say. You see what I'm saying? In other words, Paul's wrong, or it was aimed for a very specific time, or it's actually timeless. And depending on how you approach this, you're going to read very, very differently. So let's just talk about each of them very quickly. Paul's teaching is wrong here. It's very easy for us to look, and you might say this is one option. Look, Paul's a great teacher, okay? He's a godly man, deeply influential in the rise of Christianity, but he's a human, and he's a sinner. He actually told us that in the first chapter, okay? He's clearly got some issues with women. This is clearly regressive, repressive. Okay, this is what's wrong with Christianity. So the conclusion, let's just call it what it is. Okay, this is bad, it's harmful, it's wrong. And what you do is just you write it off or chuck it out or you ignore it. Okay, we can see it, obvious to see. So that's kind of the first basic approach. He's wrong. Second approach is that Paul's teaching is actually timely. In other words, now here's what I mean by this. Okay, Paul's teaching might have actually made sense. It might have been strategic for this particular church. In other words, maybe there was something going on in this particular church where there are some women that are like trying to like take control and run the whole church, and that's what he's speaking to. Maybe it's a couple of women. Or maybe it's this particular city, and people focus on, it's in Ephesus. And we know that Ephesus had this cultic worship of the goddess Artemis. And there's kind of a theory that women played a role in that worship. And so what he's doing is trying to differentiate it from Artemis worship. Or, third option is like, hey, listen, maybe it's just a moment in time. The Roman Empire, and he's trying to reach his culture. And he says, listen, this particular teaching about women's equality is going to be a hindrance here, kind of like, and I'm going to give you an example, okay, slavery. Does the New Testament condemn slavery? And the answer is, no, it doesn't. Not explicitly, okay? Christianity doesn't seem to be morally outraged by slavery. It doesn't call for its abolition, doesn't call for its overthrow. Paul says things like, slaves, serve your masters. Submit to them. Okay? Work for them as if you're working for God himself. Now, at the same time, having said that, Paul also says to slaves, hey, if you can get your freedom, do it. Okay? And Christianity certainly lays the groundwork for overturning slavery, because what it does is it says, slaves, come on in. You're welcome here. Okay? You can sit with the free people. Like, in other words, when you take free people and slaves and you put them into the same community and give slaves a voice and treat them with respect and actually allow them to have leadership positions, what does that start to do? Creates a countercultural example.
But it says, and there's no such thing as slave or free or Jew or Greek,
Yep.
man or woman. Like,
There's a passage.
yeah,
Okay, Galatians 3:28. Here's my point. Christianity may not have been working for the active overthrow of slavery. That would have been really rebellious in Roman culture. But they certainly welcomed it when it happened. And maybe the stuff with women is the same way. The prevailing culture is anti-women. Okay, wives, submit. Okay, don't pick a fight over this. But once the culture shifts, then this stuff drops away. So if that's the case, then passages like 1 Timothy 2, 8 through 15 are more of a cultural artifact. It was something that was appropriate for a particular church in a particular place at a particular time, but times are different now, so we don't need to try to, it'd be a mistake to try to apply it today because it's a different context. All right? That's the does that make sense? First approach is just to go, Paul's just wrong. He was wrong then, he's wrong now. The second approach is to say it was timely for his day and age, it was strategic, and he kind of didn't pick that fight so that he could win the bigger war. All right? That is certainly a way that you can read it. Third option is to say that no, Paul's teaching here is actually timeless, meaning there really are gender roles. Okay, maybe it's divine, not human origin. Maybe it's creational, not a product of the fall. And if that's the case, then what Paul said would still apply now. It's timeless. In other words, there's actually something, males and females are supposed to embody certain roles. Okay, and if that's the case, it was true then, it's true now. That's the third way of reading it. Now, I'm just going to say that there's a little caveat on that version. Even if you buy into that, it's still really hard to know what to do with this passage because it's extremely difficult to know what it's actually saying. Almost every single verse in this passage has things that could potentially be taken 2 or 3 different ways. And depending on how you take that, you end up with radically different things. So even if it is timeless, it's a little bit difficult to know exactly what's being stated here. So we need, like, in other words, even if you land on the timeless thing, you think there are gender roles, okay? You should be really, really cautious about drawing too big of conclusions from this passage because it's just so difficult to tell. All right? So there should be some humility there. All right. So now listen, those 3 options, does that make sense? How that covers almost every, in other words, any particular way of reading it is probably going to land in one of those 3. You're either going to say Paul's wrong, and you're working from that, or you think this was appropriate, but it was timely, it was just for that one time. Or you take it more as a timeless thing, and so therefore we've got to figure out how to apply this in our church today. Okay, now, there's something I want to say here about these 3 approaches. There is a posture that kind of goes along with each, whether you want it to or not. Well, I mean, first of all, if you take the approach that Paul's just wrong, that's actually kind of a proud, condescending approach. Meaning, you're looking and saying, like, I can actually see 2,000 years, 1,800 years, 1,700 years of church history. These people were fucking morons. They couldn't see it, but I sure can. Paul's wrong. It's like, wow, I'm pretty confident. Okay, you must be smarter than Paul. And I'm saying that first position that says Paul's just wrong actually carries a lot of, I would call it kind of historical condescension. That those people back then weren't very smart. So Paul said it, nobody got it, they just did blindly what they were. And I'm like, that actually feels to me like a very modern, culturally imperialistic way of reading history. And so, but there's some, so we want to make sure, I think everybody here would be like, oh, I don't want to be condescending. All right? Just be aware that that first approach, you easily fall into the condescension. The second approach, if you say that it was timely, it was appropriate for that time, but it's not appropriate for now because of the cultural context differences. One of the advantages that does, it actually forces you to be cross-culturally empathetic. Meaning, you're going to have to look back at that culture and go, what were the conditions that actually made that appropriate? And I think that is a really good thing for all of us to learn how to be more cross-culturally sensitive or empathetic. Does that make sense? Okay.
But to
So
go back to one as well, if we're effectively saying Paul was wrong, doesn't that kind of also contradict the concept that Paul wasn't the author?
yes, we'll talk about that in a second. That's why I'm going to actually, what I'm going to try to do today is show you that of these three approaches, the first one is very difficult to inhabit in a way that is going to be intellectually consistent without being just like culturally condescending. Okay? And so we'll talk about that. In other words, my encouragement is whatever you try to do, I think the second two options make more sense if you want to inhabit an authentically Christian position. So the first one, just be wary of cultural condescension. The second one, what it really encourages is cross-cultural empathy, which is good no matter, I think all of us would go like, oh, that's probably a good thing. Should try to understand it through the eyes of those people rather than just imposing my American paradigm on it. The third one, actually, if you were going to say that this is timeless, here's what I'm going to say. In order to, because you can actually say the timeless thing, where really what you're doing is the same form of cultural imperialism. Like when I was growing up and people in my church were like, women can't teach Sunday school. It says it right there. I do not permit women to have authority. I've heard ordained ministers say this. And they would say, it's timeless truth. And it's like, actually, what you're doing is taking your 1970s, 1980s version of Christianity that you were raised in, and you're imposing that back and saying, like, you're thinking Sunday school. They didn't even have Sunday school back then. Okay, and we know that women did teach. I'll talk about that, okay, in certain contexts. So my point is, if you're going to hold to that timeless thing, here's what I think you need to do. You actually need to be incredibly imaginative to say, how would this actually have made sense where people went, oh my goodness, this is a good thing. In order for you to get to that point, it's hard. That will require the most intellectual work, the most intellectual rigor to actually, if you're going to say the timeless thing, be prepared to go like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to really challenge my thinking to understand how this might be God's design and intent for all humanity. Okay? And I think it's possible. Okay? So, that's the second point. Does this make sense so far? Kind of flying through this? Okay, let's talk about problems with the first option. The idea that Paul's just wrong. So this is the third point. I've already said it, but I think that there's a lot of pride in this approach. Paul's wrong, I'm right. I can clearly see what everyone else has missed. I think there's a few additional problems in addition to pride or condescension. First of all, if somebody says, I can tell Paul's wrong, I can tell that this part of Scripture is not true, it's not accurate. The question is, what's your objective standard that sits up above Scripture that actually allows you to be like, oh, this part's right, this part's not right? That is actually a really difficult question to answer. Because then the question becomes, how did you validate objectively that whatever that standard was accurate too? For most of us, the reason we have this objection and say that's clearly wrong is because you were raised American. It's your culture. All right? So it's really difficult, and what will happen is if you meet somebody from another culture like Africa or the Middle East that comes from a much more traditional culture, what is obvious to you will not be obvious to them. And when you try to just tell them like, well, duh, it's obvious, they're going to look at you and say, wow, you are really American and you just think that your morality should be our morality. And I'll tell you what, Africans don't like that. Okay? They recognize what cultural imperialism looks like. What'd you say? Yeah, exactly. They've kind of experienced it. They're like, I think we heard this before. Okay, the second thing, this one's really important. If Paul's just wrong here, it's not just Paul who says this. You ready for this? Paul says, wives, submit, and then he talks about adorning and quietness. Peter, 1 Peter chapter 3, go read it this week, tells wives to be subject to their husbands. He uses the language of submitting. He uses the language of adorning. He uses the language of being quiet. And he says they're weaker vessels. Now listen, if Paul says that, and he's wrong, and Peter says that, then he's also wrong. Okay? And you go, who taught Peter? Jesus? Was Jesus pro-woman? Certainly seems like it. How come Jesus, if he was so pro-woman and wanted to do this, did not pick one of those women to be one of his 12 disciples? If you are an outsider and you want to critique Christianity, that is a very legitimate critique. And what I'm going to tell you is I think Jesus and Paul and Peter all had basically the same view. So if Paul's wrong, then Peter's wrong, and so is Jesus. If you're going to be intellectually consistent with the data. Okay, now back to 1 Timothy. Remember something. Why have we spent the past 2-3 weeks talking about shalom and pax? Okay, the kingdom. In other words, we're like, this whole book is actually about how God's shalom, the pax Christos, is so much better than the pax Romana. And if that's the case, if that's what we're talking about here, the kingdom is coming, God's bringing his shalom. If Paul, Peter, and Jesus all miss the mark on flourishing of women, then why should you trust them on anything else they say? See what I'm saying? That's a pretty in other words, if they were wrong, that was a pretty major whiff. And so whatever else they say about shalom, I'd be a little skeptical. Okay? Fourth, if you're willing to distrust Scripture at this point and say, oh, this is wrong, you're inevitably going to find other places that you distrust too. Like all the places where it talks about submitting to leaders. All the places where it talks about who not to have sex with, like anybody you're not married to. All the places where it talks about love your neighbor. All the places where it talks about turn the other cheek. All the places where it's, like, my point is, there's actually a whole bunch of places. Homosexuality, you're going to be like, no, he's wrong there. Anything that you don't like, you're going to be able to say, no, he's just wrong. And what you're going to start to find is you're really cutting and snipping, and you're ending up with a version of Christianity that really just reflects you and your culture, and that's a very American thing. So, I don't think this is a great option. The real problem with this approach is that what it does is it actually tries to salvage Paul, or it tries to salvage, like the rest of the New Testament, or at least salvage Jesus, or maybe salvage Christianity. But the stuff about gender, sex, immorality, etc. is so tightly integrated into the New Testament and the rise of Christianity that the only way you can really hold this safely, this position with intellectual integrity, is to say, listen, why don't we just go the whole way and say Christianity's wrong? Romanism was wrong. Christianity was wrong. Like, I actually think that if you're going to say Jesus is wrong, but try to say Paul is wrong, but Jesus was right, or Peter was right, or Christianity is right, I think you're going to if you run into somebody that is actually thoughtful and has actually looked at your text, they're going to say, you're not being very consistent. Why don't you just go the whole way and say Christianity is wrong? And there's actually more integrity in that, okay? But if you want to actually try to be a Christian, basically what I'm saying here is, if you're like, no, I really do believe Jesus rose from the dead. And Matt, to your point, the idea, the New Testament claims that we got this from God, that God spoke. I think this option is not going to be particularly helpful. Okay? So my encouragement is like, go, well, okay, let me look for another option besides just saying this is wrong. All right? Fourth, can I give you the data points? Real quick. I've got like 11 of them. Okay, here we go. Is this making sense so far? Okay. First of all, the Rodney Stark article that I posted on Slack, not the Rodney Stark article. I'll come to that in just a second. I'll come to this in just a second. First of all, there's a historical data point that you must take into consideration. It's this. And this is, if you read through the Rodney Stark article that I posted, okay, it's deep. Let me give you the major takeaway. He says, and he's not a Christian, or he wasn't when he wrote this. I don't know if he is now. But he's like, hey guys, if Christianity was such a regressive, repressive, anti-woman religion, then how come women were the primary converts? And he goes through historically, and he says, we know from the data that all the early, not all, but like the vast majority of the early converts were women and were slaves. And they looked at this system, they looked at what Paul was saying here, and they went, oh my goodness, we want in. And so whatever you think about that, when you read this text, you should be going like, what would this have sounded like to somebody in that context? Roman Empire, you're a woman or a slave. Okay, and this is where that second article that I posted, the summary of this book called From Shame to Sin. Read the summary that I posted on Slack. It's much shorter. The book's great, but it is academic. But he's basically going, Christianity had a very different message that was completely countercultural to the Roman culture, but you need to understand what the Roman culture was. Okay. No matter how regressive it looks to us, it didn't look regressive to them, and so we need to try to understand that. Okay? Second thing, in verse 8, where he says, I desire then that in every place the men should, he basically is going to say, in every place I desire men should pray and women should do this. That language of every place gets used a couple of times in the New Testament, but it's always referring to things that are like, so it is in all the churches. So this probably wasn't just for this particular church or this particular city. And what we know is the early Christianity, all through the Roman Empire, all bought into this. Okay? And that's what everybody converted into. So that's the second thing. It's probably more universal than just the one location. Third thing, the connection with shalom and pax. This idea of men pray, that is actually, when you go back and read this, and this is one of the new developments for me, everybody tends to read this as just like it's a gender issue. And what we need to do is to actually read this in context of, no, this is actually a worldview issue. And he's going, men, one of the biggest things that you can do to like subvert the Roman worldview, Pax Romana, instead of being like masculine and a doer, I want you to be a prayer. And then women, I want you to, adorn yourselves with modesty, with good works. It's this call into their full participation. Let me say it this way. Paul is calling women and slaves into full participation as kingdom shalom bringers. That make sense? Now, what that looks like, we got to sort that out. But the point is when you start reading this passage in light of the shalom pax thing that's going on, it changes the way you read. Okay? Also, when you start reading it going, well, what was the Roman Pax Romana? What was Roman culture like? What was Roman sexual culture like? What was Roman slave culture like? Oh my goodness. You start to see some differences. Okay, fourth thing, adorn. When he talks about adorning in verse 9, he's not saying that you can't do clothes, braids, or jewelry. Anybody got braids? Braids? You have braid? That's okay. You're safe. Jewelry. Anybody got? Yes. All you.
Jordan.
Okay. You got jewel. No, listen. What the text is not saying is don't do braids, don't do dresses, don't do jewelry, don't try to be attractive. It's saying that's not your identity. Your identity, now this doesn't necessarily make it any easier, modesty and self-control. We'll talk more about that next week. Okay? And he says good works, and then he talks about learning, quietly, submissiveness, those things. But the point is, in other words, don't just read this and go, oh, the Bible's so stupid. It doesn't want women to wear jewelry. That, if you read it that way, you're not reading it very smartly. Yeah.
How do you get, I know you're on a roll, if you don't have to address this, that's okay, but like, how do you read it and see, oh, these things aren't your identity, and not just don't wear these things? So I read it and I just see.
So what he said, here's what will be helpful, is to read this passage and to read the 1 Peter 3 passage where they both talk about adorning, and to start to say, so for right now, the short answer, that's a great question. The short answer is to start reading both of those passages and going, is this really anti-jewelry? Because here's one of the things we know. Christian women, I'm trying to think if we know that they wore jewelry. Like the point is, let me come back to that. I think as you read this and just start asking that question, is he saying, in other words, is it really about adorning? Think about like why, I think there's a reason, why are women adorning themselves? What are they doing with their adornment? Like what's going on in our culture with how you dress? This is something, like you guys can tell me, you're women.
Isn't it like the women who used to make braids and use that like they were available
So-
for services?
So we're gonna, we'll talk more about what the Roman culture, but the point is, Roman culture actually, now here's another thing about modesty. Modesty was huge in Roman culture for freeborn women. Okay, this may end up taking us 3 weeks to get through all of this, but this is worth looking at. What Paul tells them when he says modesty, quietness, submissiveness, that's the exact same things the Romans were telling them, but for very different reasons. Okay? And so we're going to need to unpack what was going on in the Roman culture. All right?
Everyone should watch Rome.
Watch Rome?
Yes, it was a series from, I don't know, probably 10, 15 years ago.
Is it okay? I need to go watch Rome now.
It's everything you're talking about.
Okay. So, and again, now here's the thing. I have most of the stuff that I've seen written on this is not written primarily thinking about the Roman Empire cultural worldview versus Christian cultural worldview. And this is what Rodney Stark is asking. He's going, hey guys, we really ought to try to figure out how you had this marginal fringe thing that was super counterculture that in really about 400 years went from being marginal fringe to everybody had bought into it. And it wasn't because just some government said like, hey, y'all need to believe this now. They bought into it. It was a different world. So we need to understand what was going on in that worldview to understand how we get to the new one.
1 Peter 3, by the way, makes it really clear its identity. Like, because it just says, don't let your adorning be external, gives examples. Don't let your adorning be the hidden person or the heart or the imperishable beauty of a gentle, quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. So he's talking about focus on the inward reality, not the external reality.
Okay.
Could there be like, and obviously.
Hold it just a second.
Yeah, no, I'll
Let me run through my points because we're still, okay. When he says good works, this is the fifth one, in verse 10. Just remember what I said last week. I think that is a call into this shalom thing, this kingdom thing. In other words, it's a call to be like a public benefactor and participate. You're working for other people's good. That was the part that was super countercultural. And the call here is for women and slaves to get in on that as well, not just the royalty. not just the rich. Okay. When you see men and women in this passage, okay, I desire then that in every place the men should pray. Likewise, the women should adorn themselves. Let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. One of the things you need to know is that the word that's used in the Greek there can also be translated husband or wife. So reread this passage and just go, is he talking about male-female relationships, or is he just talking about in a husband-wife relationship? I don't think it's just in a husband-wife relationship, but what you need to know is that is a way of reading this. In other words, is he saying, I don't permit women to domineer, and that may actually be a better translation of this word, to teach or have authority over. I don't permit women to domineer their husbands. Okay? 7, when he says, let women learn. That's a huge affirmation, especially in that culture. Don't miss it. In other words, Christians were the ones that came in and said, by the way, women, absolutely, we're going to educate them. Slaves, we're going to educate them too. In the Roman culture, it was only the elite that got educated. The Romans in general did not educate their women, even the elite women. Christians came and said, every woman, even slave women, okay, and slaves in general, we're going to educate them. So there's a massive, if you're wondering, like, why would people get into this? Part of this was like, oh, you can be a learner, and you can be a full participant in this kingdom work of shalom. Okay. Submissiveness. In the New Testament, it's never absolute. So when you see wives submit to your husbands, slaves submit to your masters, everybody submit to the government, there is always an asterisk. And the asterisk is, but not when they tell you to do something contrary to Jesus. Jesus is Lord, not Caesar, okay? Not your pastor, and not your husband. So that, in other words, whenever you hear this submit language, wife, submit. You need to, that's not what the New Testament is. That is a bastardization. The New Testament Christians were always like, you submit as much as possible, but never deny Jesus.
And you submit to one another.
And you submit to one another. Yeah. So you see what I'm saying? So just keep that in mind. That teacher exercise authority phrase. You guys heard the phrase, that's what's called potentially. Is he saying, I don't want them to do two things? Or is he saying one thing that goes with those two together? There's a term for it called hendiadys. If you say, hey, don't eat and run. Or if you say, hey, don't drink and drive. It's two things joined by an and. But what you really mean, you're not saying like, listen, I don't want you to drink. And I don't want you to drive. You're saying, like, no, when you drink, don't drive. There's two things that go together. When you eat, don't rush off. Don't run right away. When you teach, in other words, is there a kind of authoritative teaching that goes with exercising authority? You see what I'm saying? In other words, he may be talking about a very specific kind of thing here, but we're not sure. Keep that in mind. Okay, Adam and Eve, just note, there may very well be a creational reference. In other words, he may be saying the relationships with gender stuff here are not a result of the fall. They were actually part of creation. If you're going to understand that third way, where this is timeless, you're going to have to go back to creation. You're also going to have to look at the Trinity. I think that's the only way it's going to make any sense. Last thing, childbirth, just note, there's a connection to children. We have a very different view of children in our culture than they did in theirs, and that the Romans did. Okay? And we'll talk more about that next week. But you need to, in other words, don't miss that. But you need to understand the differences. Okay. Real quick, this is the trajectory, the last part. Homework for this week. Read this passage multiple times. Try to think of it as many angles as possible. Number 2, ask yourself, what do I think it's really saying? And try to work both of those timely or timeless. If you think it's timely, what was the scenario that was like strategic back then, but it's different now? We don't need it.
So they
If
can
you
be both.
would-
They can be both, like the parables, like it's of the time, but also you can relate it to current.
yeah, so we got to
So
think
it's
it.
not just one or the other.
What I'm saying is, I think I could support both interpretations, and it's important. So in other words, if you say, Christian, what's the right answer? I'm going to say I could try to. I have one where I'm leaning, but it's important to try to work both of those. Okay. Third, context really is key. Understanding the more I'm reading about the Roman Empire, the more I'm going, oh my goodness. Read that summary that I posted of the sin to shame, because it's a really short, readable summary from the Gospel Coalition. Kevin DeYoung wrote it. It will give you the contents of this book very quickly. Reflect on what our culture preaches. Our culture says women ought to have every right, every opportunity, just like men do. And then you go, to do what? And it's to live for yourselves. That's really what our culture wants. You should have the right to live for yourself. Both men and women, this is the second thing that our culture is currently right in the middle of a debate about. Men and women both ought to have the right or opportunity not just to live for themselves, but to choose which gender you want to live out of. What works best for you. Okay, and I'm going to say Christianity has a different vision. Number one, none of us live for ourselves anymore. You live for Jesus. Number two, all of us flourish best by learning how to live with the identity that we were born into and given. And there's both like blessing and curse there. Okay? Number 5, ask yourself, why did women opt in? There was something attractive. If you do not understand what is attractive about this, you will never get to what this passage is really saying. Okay, so you want to work to understand that. Number 6, last thing, ask yourself, what do I do if Jesus lands someplace that I don't like? In other words, come back to that. Maybe you do think that Paul is wrong. And maybe that means Peter is wrong too. But what if you meet Jesus, he walks through the door and he's like, no, listen, I really land on this. You know, maybe he says it was strategic, it's timely. Or maybe he says, no, it really is timeless. But the question for Christians, this is how you really know if you're a Christian. Did you get into Christianity because it agreed with your version of the worldview? Or did you get into Christianity because you're like, dude, I just want to be with Jesus. I think he is alive. And wherever he lands, that's ultimately where I'm going to land. So if I get to heaven and Jesus is like, dude, you got it wrong, I'm going to be like, I got it wrong. I'll go tell everybody I was wrong. I'm going to come back and go, dude, I was wrong. Jesus, but I'm with Jesus. Or are you going to be like, no, if that's where Jesus is, I'm out. See how revealing that is? So we need to work this. All right. Can we pray? This is a lot, isn't it? And this is just priming the pump.